Today we're going to be talking about the most effective method for farming XP. There is going to end up being some other things that we'll talk in today's video, but for the most part we're talking about XP, which the most effective way of gaining XP is going to end up grinding specific dungeons. So if I bring up this website for you guys, and I'll put a link in the description so you can check it out, you can see that the mad lads of this video game have already created a very in-depth tier list that talks about the very specific amounts of XP, glyph leveling, high tier push, which is obviously when you're much stronger in the game, as well as objective monsters and so on and so forth. It's crazy, man. The Diablo fan base is popping off hard. So in particular, what we're going to be focusing on today is I'm just going to give you the tools with which you'll need in order to go through this list and figure it all out for yourselves. But basically, you can see that S tier XP is what you're going to be focusing on. So in the dry steps, Onyx Hold. If I go back into the game, look where I am. I'm right by the Onyx Hold. Now, there is a couple ways that you can end up grinding the XP out of these dungeons. Most effective is doing it with a group, but it is going to end up being slightly different the way that you'll end up doing these dungeons when you're doing them solo or with a group. Because the funny thing is that the most optimal method of getting XP is going into the dungeon, killing all of the elites or the specific mobs, and then just moving on. So you can see right here for the Onyx steps or Onyx Hold, slay all red ghost zombies, slay 3 languishing corpses, and then there is no objective 3 or objective 4, which means that you basically will end up doing all of that within a 5-minute time frame on average, and then move on. You leave the dungeon, you go back in. So basically the way that that works when you're playing single player is you're going to end up leaving the dungeon, then you're gonna leave the game, go back to the character menu, come back into the game, and you'll just go back into the dungeon. Now, fun fact that I didn't know up until making this video is that if you end up logging out of the game within a dungeon, it's gonna boot you to the next town. But if you end up leaving the dungeon and while you're out in the open world, you leave the game and come back in, you actually won't be warped back to the nearest town or waypoint. You'll just be warped right back into where you started. So that's pretty cool. At the very least, this dungeon in particular is right here, but a lot of the area dungeons are a little bit further away from waypoints. So that would be the reason why you would want that method. Now, if you're doing this with a group of people, it's gonna be slightly different because you don't have to actually log out or anything. All you gotta do is leave the dungeon, leave the group, go back into the dungeon to create a new instance of it, and then get all of your buddies to be invited into the group, and then they can just join in on the dungeon. I also want to stress that this is not nightmare variations of these dungeons. This is just the normal dungeons because we are focusing on XP. Glyph leveling, as you can see in this tab, that's going to end up being nightmare dungeons specifically, so you can kind of see which ones are the most optimal for that. Usually that's got to do with how quickly you can complete the dungeons and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, today's video is focused on XP. And I think that pretty much covers it. This Google Doc is absolutely insane. As you can see, it shows everything that you would want to know about the specific dungeons. So it not only talks about the objectives, it also talks about the dungeon notes. So corpses, shock lance, tempest, suppressor, so on and so forth. It also mentions over here whether there's an intermission event, which I assume is when you get halfway through the dungeon and you're forced to kill everything in a room before you can progress onward, yes or no. So obviously certain dungeons are going to end up being more efficient than others, and I'm not necessarily saying that Onyx Hold is the one that you should be doing. I'm just using that as an example to let you guys know that it is an option.